One of the most outstanding places in China is Macau. This place differs from the rest of the country in a lot of ways, and there's actually a very good reason for that. If you're interested in finding out more, you're in the right place. Hi, my name is Sebastian and you're watching 7 Facts. The Macau Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China, or simply Macau, is a special little place in China, as you may already know. This is one of those regions of China where the one country, two systems principle is at work. What do I mean by that? Well, just like Hong Kong, Macau too was a European colony, this time belonging to the Portuguese. And when they gave it back to China, they did so under certain conditions that we'll get into in a few minutes. Now, with that being said, Macau does stand out in many ways. First, the scenery. The unique blend of Portuguese and Chinese architecture combined with modern structures created a one-of-a-kind urban landscape. Economically, the city ain't doing so bad. As of 2021, Macau has one of the highest per capita incomes in the world at almost $44,000. This, coupled with a very high Human Development Index, led to Macau having the third highest life expectancy in the world. Only Hong Kongers and Monegasques live longer, but only ever so slightly. By the way, we are talking about a population of 682,000 people crammed in an area of 115 square kilometers, which averages out at 21,340 people found on every square kilometer. That's the largest density of humans you'll find in any other country or dependency. With such statistics, there's gotta be a lot to discover about this place, right? Well, yeah. So don't go anywhere just yet, cause we're about to find out how Macau got to be what it is today. Already during the Qin dynasty, who unified China for the first time, the region that's today Macau was under Chinese control. Various Chinese dynasties came to rule these lands in the centuries to come, but there was nothing out of the ordinary happening around here. Well, a big exception might be in 1277 AD, when approximately 50,000 refugees who fled from the Mongol hordes settled in this coastal area. Still, there were no major developments popping up. But everything changed in 1513. That year, Jorge Alvarez, a Portuguese explorer, became the first European to reach China by sea. This was during the Age of Discovery, when Europeans began to travel east and west, not necessarily out of a thirst for knowledge, although that too played its role. The primary motivation, however, was, well, money, plus glory, plus religion. So after Alvarez, Europeans were very interested in the trade opportunities China had to offer. Merchants established a trading post, Tamao, in the waters of Hong Kong, which wasn't to the liking of the traditionally isolationist Ming government of China. After some military clashes between the Chinese and Portuguese navies, Tamao was disbanded, the merchants were expelled, and trade was banned. However, there was now blood in the water, so to speak, and neither part wanted to give up on some very lucrative trade deals. So Portuguese merchants continued to attempt to settle on other parts of the Pearl River estuary, and they finally settled on Macau. To understand what happened next, we need to expand the history a bit. So Tamao was disbanded in 1521 following a Portuguese defeat at the Battle of Tunmen. The Portuguese continued to try their luck by force, but they weren't very successful. There were several naval battles between the two in the following decades, and the Portuguese lost quite a few ships. Even worse, the Chinese captured weapons from them, which they reverse-engineered and then mass-produced, like the swivel gun they named the Phalange cannon, which translates to the Frankish cannon. Now, why in the world would the Chinese call a Portuguese cannon Frankish? Because that's how the Portuguese were first known. According to Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit missionary in China, the Portuguese were named Franks by the Muslims, who still retain the memory of the Crusaders when they again encountered Europeans in India and China. Ricci also believed that because of the stories told by the Muslims in China about how crude and cruel the Franks were, Europeans had a very difficult time in obtaining permission to enter China. Now, why does this matter? Because at one point, the Portuguese switched tactics. Instead of trying to force their way into China, they decided to negotiate. And when they came back, they presented themselves as the Portuguese, not the Franks. And so, in 1554, Portugal and China came to an agreement. Macau was rented by Portugal in exchange for silver, a lease that became permanent just 3 years later. Initially, Macau was not that big of a deal. But very rapidly, the small settlement of Portuguese merchants became a full-blown city. A Catholic diocese was of course established in 1576, followed by a local senate in 1583. Trade began to flourish, but violence soon followed. The initial agreement forbade the Portuguese to fortify Macau or to stockpile weapons, but they built themselves a fort anyway, the Fortaleza de Monte. This was in response to the frequent attacks they suffered from the Dutch. Portugal retained Macau, but the colony went into decline anyway. In 1639, Japan halted trade pretty much with everyone, and since Macau served as a major trade node towards Japan, this was a mighty blow. Furthermore, there were wars and revolts back in Europe, and the Dutch continued to harass Portuguese colonies, so access to trade routes was severely restricted. Rubbing salt into wound, in 1644 the Qing dynasty overtook the Ming, and China began to enforce its own isolationist policies. The Qing authorities exercised a much greater role in governing Macau, so the colony became almost irrelevant. That changed though during the 18th century, when the British began to trade opium in China, making Macau an important stopping point once more. The opium trade led to the First Opium War, which wasn't great news for Macau. The war created the British colony of Hong Kong, so Macau lost its role as a major European port. Nevertheless, Portugal capitalized on China's weakness. Macau now refused to pay rent and instead annexed the islands of Taipa and Colonial, followed by Lapa and Montaña. In 1887, following the Second Opium War, the Sino-Portuguese Treaty of Peking was signed. In it, the Portuguese gave Lapa and Montaña back, but kept Taipa and Colonial, and also gained permanent right to Macau, not just a lease. During World War II, Macau mostly avoided the conflict, but the following Chinese Civil War swelled the colony's population. This newly found access to a large workforce enabled Macau to grow its economy. Manufacturing and tourism boomed, and casino gambling became legal, bringing in a lot of money. Still, this was no paradise. In 1966, residents rioted against colonial rule. The riots, known as the 12-3 incident, led to Portugal losing full control. They now agreed to cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party. In the next decades, China and Portugal began to negotiate for Macau's future. And, after 442 years, the colony was transferred back to Chinese control in 1999 under the condition that Macau would retain its political and economic systems for 50 years. Because of its history, Macau remains a special administrative region of China. It's similar to Hong Kong in many ways. Chinese national law doesn't generally apply here. There are multiple political parties, a separation of power, and a judicial system that's based on the Portuguese civil law. People of Macau have their own passports, and even mainland Chinese citizens are subject to border controls. However, regional courts are ultimately subordinate to China's socialist civil law. The National People's Congress can override any judicial processes. Although autonomous, Macau is definitely not independent from Beijing, and there is now a growing fear that Macau's separate administration might not retain its particularities, not even for the agreed 50 years. Gambling in Macau has a long history. This activity has been legal here since the 1850s, and since then Macau came to be known as the gambling capital of the world. The Portuguese government introduced gambling in an attempt to generate more revenues. But at first, and for a long time, this was a conservative practice. There were around 200 fantan houses in Macau where only Chinese gambling games were practiced. This changed in the 1960s when a Hong Kong-Macau syndicate gained monopoly rights to all forms of gambling. They introduced Western-style games and modernized the marine transport system to Hong Kong, bringing in millions of gamblers every year. A second boost to the industry came in 2002 when the government decided to end monopoly and grant licenses to several companies. Today, Macau is practically dependent on gambling. I know it sounds ironic, but it's true. About half of the region's revenues come from this industry alone. Today, Macau dwarfs any other gambling city in the world, including the famous Las Vegas Strip, which means a lot of money, but all that wealth does come at a price. By the way, Macau is the only place in China where gambling is actually legal. Visiting the casinos of Macau is one activity you can do if you have the funds for it, that is. If you don't, or you're not the gambler type, no worries, Macau still has plenty to offer. And the one place I'd recommend you to go to is the historic center, of course. The whole place is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, by the way. The center is literally where East and West met. The general aesthetics of Portuguese architecture are intertwined with Chinese temples and traditional housing. The historic locations bear witness to the unique assimilation and coexistence of Chinese and Portuguese cultures. By the way, on a side note, the Ama Temple still stands and can be found here. Dedicated to the sea goddess Matsu, the temple is thought to be the namesake of Macau. When the Portuguese arrived in 1513, they asked for the place name. The locals thought they were asking about the temple and replied Makok, the pavilion of the mother. Makok became Macau, and the rest is history. Oh, and the food is reportedly exquisite. It's a unique blend of Cantonese and Portuguese cuisine with influences from Indian, Malay, and Hong Kong dishes. I mean, come on, what more could you wish for? Remember I told you about the Portuguese claiming the islands of Taipai and Colonial? Well, those islands exist no more, as in they are no longer islands. Since 2005, the two islands became one, Kotai, a portmanteau between Colonial and Taipa. 5.2 square kilometers of reclaimed land were created primarily to provide Macau with a new gambling and tourism area. Remember, this is the most densely populated region in the world. Land is scarce. Now, the reclaimed area is known as Kotai City or the Kotai Strip, and it's where you'll find the vast majority of hotels and casinos. And that was all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you leave. Leave your comments downstairs, and if you wish to do so, you can help out this channel through my Patreon page. I do hope to see you next time. Bye.